that we are building on stuff that we did yesterday, but there are some continuities, and maybe I will try to factor them in as we go along. So yesterday we were looking at art, in Buddhist art in India, and we were looking at it from the ancient times. By ancient times we mean as close as we can get to the time of the Buddha. The earliest that we have any evidence of is from the time of Emperor Ashoka. And we looked at Emperor Ashoka's contribution in some detail in the morning session. And also the fact that apart from being the great patron, he was also, of course, India's first real emperor, because his kingdom stretches all the way across India from the eastern part in Assam all the way to what is today presently Pakistan and Afghanistan. Ashoka makes a great contribution by writing edicts on rocks, and interestingly, there is also evidence that as much as he supported Buddhism, he also continued to make donations to other religious groups. And so we looked at a couple of caves which he has donated to the Ajivikas. We looked at, towards the end of the day, we wound up with the Gandharan area. I think maybe I will show, since some of you are here who were not here yesterday, I'll probably look at, show you all the map from yesterday's presentation, because that gives you an idea of the kind of geography that is involved, and also briefly about the different communities, the different peoples who were active in that area, and through whose connections to trade and the Silk Route now today, most particularly, we have the spread of Buddhism to China. So this is the context in which we are going to look at today two complexes. One is Kizill, and the other is the massive, really possibly the largest collection of Buddhist art anywhere at Dunhuang. So, Ajahn, I'll just take out, yesterday's, they were not here yesterday, so I'll just show the map.
On desktop?
Yeah, it's on desktop, right? Yesterday's, it was this one.
Yeah. Maybe you please minimize this one first. Minimize.
Yeah.
On desktop.
Why it doesn't open? Is it on? I think it's still opening. 1 second. This one.
Yeah.
This one. No, not that one.
This one. Number one.
Yeah, actually, yeah, it is that one. Sorry, it is that one. No, not this one. Sorry. Where's the? This one only. Sorry. This map. But it's not, this one is not the one showing there.
Yeah, okay.
How do I do that?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So yesterday, how many of you again? All of you mostly are here for the first time, right? You all were not here yesterday. So this map is an extremely important context in which we are going to do some work today. This is India. This is the extent of Ashoka's empire. And in the ancient times, China was just there. Today, of course, it has Tibet and this region as well. So China is really huge now. And the period that we are talking about in this map is really around the turn of the millennium. And these are the various people, the communities, the different races. And these people here, this area we call the steppes, which is just, a lot of grassland on which there were nomadic people. Do we understand nomadic people? Yes. So they are pastoralists, they have herds, and they move about throughout the area in search of pastures. Now, these communities here, and there are the Tokharians, the Yuezhe, and all these tribes, they did not have settled cities or a country or anything. They were constantly on the move. And in the process of moving, they also, around 600 BC, it is estimated in this area, that man first started riding horses. Right? First, in China, by then they were still hitching the horses to carriages. But the minute man began riding horses, he gets a different kind of mobility. And these people here, they mastered the art of riding and archery. So they became really ferocious warriors, and every now and then they would raid the towns over here in China for food and also for silk. China produced silk from very, very ancient times, possibly 3rd century BC. And actually, the silk was something that the chiefs of these tribes, they really treasured. And these areas were also very cold in winter, and they used to make very fine jackets and line them with silk. And so they looked more royal, and they liked how they looked with the silk. So they really went after two things, food and silk. And today we are really going to look at, can you see this area here? This is a desert area. It's a very large desert in this map. Of course, the scale is very different. Yesterday, we were looking at this area. This area, Gandhara, is here. Alexander comes from Greece up to here. There were Greeks here, right? And the silk routes, actually from China, went through this region to Rome. And yesterday we discussed how trade routes, the wealth generated on the trade routes made it possible for those communities to support Buddhism. And by support, we mean the creation of resting places, of monasteries, and great works of art. All right? So we looked at the Gandharan art here, which definitely has Greco-Roman sort of influence in the manner in which the human body is treated, in the way the Buddha's robes, the monks' robes are displayed. And we have Heracles featuring, as I showed you yesterday, really Heracles and Vajrapani. He's often depicted, there is a whole story there. There is lots of work that's been done on that. Indian Buddhism, doctrinally, we looked at that too. Doctrinally, by the time of Ashoka, there had been many discussions and debates, and there were several schools already. And Ashoka, by the records of the Theravada school, Ashoka becomes an emperor. He ascends to the throne about 218 years after the Buddha's parinirvana. So in that time, there are already many schools. The first discussions and disagreements are about Vinaya. But later on, there are doctrinal differences too. So we find that after the first schism, where all of you know, there was the Sthaviravada and there was the Mahasangika, the two groups. And within both groups, then there were subsequent divisions. And one of the groups that splits off from the Sthavira group, this is in the time of Ashok, when there is a council which is held in Patliputta. One of the big groups was the Sarvastivada. The Sarvastivada, Sabathivada in Pali, they were the ones who were most soundly defeated in that council. And so they move from, this is the area of Patliputra, they come towards central area to Mathura, and from there they go on to occupy Kashmir, Gandharan region. Why are the Sarvastivada important? Because they were one of the biggest schools actually in India. They also produced vast amounts of literature. Most of it is not available to us in Sanskrit anymore, unfortunately, but you do have the Chinese translations and some of it in Tibetan as well. The Sarvastivadas doctrinally were somewhat problematic in some of their views, so they were subject to argumentative debate attacks, not just from within Buddhism, but from outside as well. Later on, Nagarjuna, who is one of our finest dialecticians and a great Buddhist leader, he too, when he refutes the positions of the earlier schools, the primary sort of target is the Sarvastivada school. Having said that, if we study somebody or some school only from the point of view of how they were refuted, then we don't understand them actually. In order to do complete justice to them, we must study their materials on their own terms, right? Because they were also great masters. So if we just study some text which refutes their position, we should not think that we have understood the whole school. No, there was a vast body of literature, and today there are two extant Abhidhamma corpuses. The Pali Abhidhamma is one of them. The other is the Sarvastivada Abhidharma. They wrote down their Abhidharma in the time of a Central Asian who came all the way into India, and we looked yesterday at how his kingdom connected this part all the way across this to here. And because of that connection, the mobility of people increased hugely. Trade, of course, was heavily supported, protected, and there was a great blossoming of Buddhism. Gandharan Buddhism really blossoms under the reign of Emperor Kanishka, who, after Emperor Ashok, is the greatest patron, royal patron of Buddhism. And just as the Theravada council in Ashok's time is not really reflected in the chronicles of the Chinese and the Tibetans, we also know that in the time of Kanishka there was a council in Kashmir, which is not recorded in the Theravada chronicles, possibly because it is really so far. But it is at that time that the Sarvastivada Abhidharma gets formalized, and they write a very huge commentary which is called the Mahavibhasha. The Mahavibhasha, from that they take the name Vaibhashikas. Those who accept the Sarvastivada Abhidharma are called the Vaibhashikas. But in the Gandharan area, there were also some Sarvastivada who said, we don't accept this Abhidharma. Buddha did not teach it. We will stay with the sutras, and so they are known to us as the Sautrantikas. And the discussions and debates between them are highlighted in the work of the 4th century genius, Arya Vasubandhu. Yes, Vasubandhu was from this region in Gandhara, specifically a town called Purushpura, which is today Peshawar. He was a Sautrantika. And the genius of Vasubandhu, we know how, through numerous works. He was a Sautrantika, so he was not doctrinally affiliated to the school which studied the Abhidharma. But out of curiosity and interest, he went to the Kashmir area where the Vaibhashikas were. He studied their Abhidharma and he wrote a commentary which is called the Abhidharma Kosha. Today, if any of us want to embark on the study of Mahayana, most good schools will tell you, read the Abhidharma Kosha first. We start with the Abhidharma Kosha because when we look at debates within Buddhism and the arising of different schools, please understand that all philosophical debates happen really in the context of Abhidharma. What is the ultimate constituent of reality? How do dharmas behave? Are they ultimately existent or not? These are some of the things that actively engaged Buddhist masters throughout time. So Vasubandhu goes and writes the Abhidharma Kosha. Having written it, of course, the Vaibhashikas in Kashmir are extremely pleased. Only one or two suspect that there are some words here and there which show that he was not fully sympathetic to their view. He comes back to Gandhara and he writes a commentary to his own work, which is called the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. Yeah, Bhashya. A Bhashya is a commentary. In his auto-commentary, as we call it, he refutes the views in the commentary itself, right, in the Abhidharma Kosha. So he studies the Abhidharma, writes a commentary to the Abhidharma, then writes a commentary to his own commentary in which he refutes those views. So you can fully grasp the genius of this man. Today, this text is available to us as a combination of both. It was translated into French by the great scholar Louis de la Vallée-Poussin. And then, of course, it has been translated into English. It is available, therefore, to us in Sanskrit also and in English. So there is no reason for us to not study it. Yes? And it's a very, very important text to understand the debates that arise later in Mahayana. And particularly in this region, because this is also where the school of Yogacara originates. Yes, with the brother of Vasubandhu, Asanga, was already a Yogacharan. Vasubandhu, after refuting the Sarvastivadins, spends some time writing more texts and eventually joins his brother and writes some really incredibly beautiful texts on the Yogacara. Yogacara school is very, very complex. Why complex? They develop their position based on their practice of meditation. So yoga, achara, the conduct determined by the practice of yoga. They have huge treatises, the major one, of course, being the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra. It is a massive compendium. It is attributed to Asanga, but generally scholars believe that it may have been in the process of compilation for some time, even before Asanga, and he probably gives it its final shape. The main aspect of the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra is that it defines the path of the Shravaka, of the Pacheka Buddha, and the Bodhisattva. So you have the Shravaka Bhumi component, which is written. Now, it is very interesting because you're looking at 4th century Gandharan area where you have a text which has the path of the Shravaka. That means leading to Arhathood. 5th century in Sri Lanka, we have Acharya Buddhaghosa, who writes the Vishuddhimagga, which is also the path of the Shravaka to Arhathood. These are things that we can study and compare to understand within the larger subcontinent how were these matters understood and discussed. Ideally, if Buddhism is one and the same and everywhere followed exactly the same, they should have been the same. But there are very interesting differences, which is what makes the religion really, really more alive, because it reflects the human tendency to contemplate, to draw out different essences from those teachings, which all of the schools uniquely inherited from the one, Shakyamuni Buddha. So the Yogacara school grows here. And it is, of course, this doesn't mean that the other schools were not present. The Dharmaguptakas were there, the Mahasangikas were there. Schools were distributed geographically at various locations. And a very good source for all this information to us is who? It is the Chinese pilgrims. Yes? And from the earliest times, Buddhist presence in China is attested as early as 1st century AD. And when we consider the distance, and at that time they just were looking at overland routes, yes, and as early as that you have Buddhism already in China, and throughout Chinese Buddhist history, Chinese people traveled either overland. There were also maritime routes, again trade routes, which facilitated the movement of monks as well. And what we know really is that the records of 3 main Chinese pilgrims give us a lot of information about Indian Buddhism. The first one is Faxian. Faxian leaves China in 400, and he leaves China. The capital is somewhere there. Chang'an was the old capital. Today it is called Xi'an. Yes, and took the Silk routes. We'll look at some pictures to see how dramatic these mountains are, how difficult the terrain was, what kind of risk to life and limb. They undertook these journeys and they came to India, traveled throughout India. He was in search of Vinaya. Faxian was mainly in search of Vinaya, and he goes all the way down to Sri Lanka before going back. Interestingly, in Sri Lanka, he finds the copy of Mahishasaka Vinaya. Sri Lanka too had other schools apart from Theravada. Anyone here from Sri Lanka? No one. Right. But you do know that in Sri Lankan history, there was the creation of the Abhayagiri Vihara, which really engaged actively with the Indian, with the developments on the Indian subcontinent. The Mahavihara, which had been established under Ashoka's son, Mahinda Thera, that remained faithful to the materials it had received from Ashokan times. And so they were the ones who preserved the orthodoxy, whereas Abhayagiri engaged. And so you do have, for example, the evidence of Avalokiteshvara. You find images of Avalokiteshvara and inscriptions and evidence of Mahayana in Sri Lanka. But it is after the arrival of Buddhaghosa in the 5th century that the fortunes of the Abhayagiri school really then could not be revived anymore, and then the entire island state becomes completely Theravada. So coming back to this region, this has therefore doctrinal developments. It has Gandharan Buddhism, Gandharan support to unique forms of art, very specific to our topic today. And it has the intermingling of several groups of people who were nomadic pastoralists, but who, because of the growth of trade, and silk trade in particular, to Rome, started settling down along these routes. And yesterday, as I explained, it was the nomadic pastoralists of this area, and that in terms of history, they are the ones who connect the East and the West. And we know little about them because we don't study so much about them in the histories that are recorded, but it is useful to know for us, particularly in Buddhist studies and in the history of Buddhist studies. Why? because this is the region where translations began into a language which was not just very different, but also written very differently. What are the challenges of translating into a language like Chinese? What happens? First of all, we know from Chinese history that their tradition had, by the time of the Buddha or around this time, Confucian teachings, and the Taoists were there. Yes, everybody knows about the Tao Te Ching, and very beautiful mystical sort of tradition. Confucius was more in terms of a sort of ethical, moral conduct, and there were a lot of rituals also. And essentially, if everybody did what is right and what is their duty in their role in society, then society would prosper. So, as a mother, if I am a good mother and I look after my children and my children respect me, there is harmony. So what brings harmony into the world is all of us functioning within the whole framework of righteousness. And the Taoists, there were many groups of Taoists, but there were those who were, at the time that we are speaking of, they were getting interested in immortality, how to become immortal. And in that process, they were experimenting with some different kinds of food products, leaving out some, trying some. And when they saw the Buddhist monks coming down the Silk Routes, and the monks would sit and meditate, they realized that this is something he is doing which is interesting. He's doing something with his breath. He is calming the body down. He seems to be able to regulate his breath. And of course, all of us know the immediate connection of breath with life and death, or no death, immortality. Why? Because when we die, what is the difference between this body and a dead body? No breath. No life, no prana. So they were the initial supporters of Buddhism. But the problem was what? I asked you all before, what is the problem? In the Chinese language, or in the Chinese culture actually, since there was no concept of karma, for example, there is no word for karma. If in your culture you don't have an idea, you don't have a word for it. So how do you translate? How do you translate an idea of nirvana? It is in the Indian context that we had the cyclical notion of time, of being stuck in samsara, going round and round and round and round. Yes? Born, reborn, born, reborn. The Chinese did not have this notion of time. So they didn't have a word for nirvana. And yet, the Buddhist texts had to be translated. And so the initial translations were kind of problematic. And so they used a concept called Ge. You will find this in every single history book of Chinese Buddhism. Ge means matching terms. So, so does this mean something like this? In Taoism, we think something like this. Could this be the word? And they used those words. So initial translations of the texts were quite problematic. Quite problematic, and did not really reflect the doctrine very fully. But the process continued over centuries. Not just over days, weeks, and months, over centuries. And they kept traveling to India in search of more teachings, and because the Indians realized there is a lot of interest and support there, Indian monks went, Buddhism went this way, Chinese monks also came this way. So yesterday we were discussing this, that in terms, when we look at world history, the spread of Buddhism from India to China is possibly one of the most incredible chapters in human history. Why? Why? Because both are great civilizations, ancient civilizations, fairly advanced in their own right. And what engages both of them is this idea. I'm calling it an idea, it's of course the entire religion. And that causes people to move up and down over a period of something like 1,000 years. This is unmatched. This is unmatched, it is unparalleled, especially because the times are so ancient. Today, if I have to come here from India, my flight map and everything, and then I look up Ayutthaya, what is there to see in Ayutthaya? So many things, so much information is available to me. These people did not know where they were heading, what lay ahead, what kind of sandstorms would hit them, what kind of snowstorms on the mountains would hit them, what kind of insect bite might kill them. So as the story goes, many monks came from China. Many of them died on the way. Many of them reached India, but they died in India. Many of them died on the way back. So the first record that we have is of Faxian. And then of course there is the great Xuanzang. Xuanzang came to India in the 7th century. He stayed at Nalanda University. He studies Yogacara. He goes back and he's of course a great translator of Yogacara materials. And subsequently in the 8th century came Yi Jing. It is really Xuanzang's record of his travels to India that help us uncover Indian Buddhist heritage. As we discussed yesterday, one of the most peculiar phenomenon in our history in India is that whereas Buddhism, which originates here, spreads all across Asia, all across. But it disappears in India. After the 12th and certainly after the 14th century, there is no evidence of Buddhism in India except in very small pockets in the north and in the northeast. Yeah, so this is really the larger doctrinal picture, the travel, and also now I would like to talk again. We have the Chinese. We had the Xiongnu who, like I explained yesterday, were attacking the other tribes who kept getting pushed this way because of the attacks and were ending up here in the Gandharan area. So some of the key groups that we look at, the major group facilitating the trade and also therefore the spread of Buddhism is the Sogdians. They are up and down all over the Silk routes, and they are actually, they speak a kind of Iranian language. And there were those, there were the Yuezhe. We saw yesterday the Yuezhe are pushed out of their area in close to China, and they come towards the Sogdian region, and they eventually are in Bactria. It is the Yuezhe who later on we know as the Kushana. And so the Kushana emperor, Kanishka, is Yuezhe. He is a Central Asian, right? Then we have the Parthians. The Parthians were here. Yes, they were Iranian speaking group as well. We have the Shaka or the Scythians. The Scythians were also horse riding nomadic peoples. And then in this region, we also have, therefore, different languages. And today we are going to look at a complex in this particular area. I'm going to try and see if my other presentation comes. So any questions so far on the general context of what we are going to do? Yes?
Can I ask questions about Yogacara?
A little bit, I'll try to answer. I'm not really well versed with. It's a very difficult school, but I'll try to answer. Yes.
Well, there was an article I briefly looked at by Alex Wayman called "In Defense of Yogacara."
Yeah, that's an old article.
Yeah, what is there to defend about Yogacara? The fact that it
Um,
was based on the experiences of Sangha as a meditator?
I can't recall that article. It's an old article. I don't really. Maybe I'll go back to it and get back to you on this. But the materials of Yogacara, particularly the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra, very, very complex and not studied much. And what happened in China is that Xuanzang brings the materials and there is a school established, but it dies out. What has happened in Tibet is that the Yogacara position has been sort of accepted by various schools, but the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism are different, not because they follow a particular Indian tradition, they study all the traditions, but just that their emphasis is different. So somewhere in that, Yogacara has been studied, accepted, but not fully realized as a doctrinal position on its own. Why Yogacara is complicated is because of their definitions of the 8. So they add 2 more consciousnesses to the 6. The idea of alai vijnana and the 3 swabhava, the 3 aspects of reality which you find in Vasubandhu's text, they are defined. They have a very complicated explanation of the mind and of perception and the cognitive process. Ultimately, when we look at the Buddhist path is mind training, right? And the Yogacara therefore have their own Abhidharma, and it is informed by these sort of, if you trace the Abhidharma positions, so you might want to read the work of Bhikkhu Dhammajoti. Again, going back to Sarvastivada though. Bhikkhu Dhammajoti, he was at Hong Kong University, he's retired now, and he's got his own school. Theravada monk from Malaysia, but being Chinese, he read Chinese texts, and he is one of those people who study Sarvastivada on their own merit, without necessarily taking recourse to all the people who refute only, right? So Bhikkhu Dhammajyoti's work is very interesting. There's a smaller book in which he talks about the kind of doctrinal debates within Buddhism relating to perception. Right? So, because the entire path, just to give you a brief overview, what is even in the Theravada Pali texts, the Buddha is constantly saying we have to see yatha bhuta. No? We have to see things the way they are. What does it mean? We don't see them the way they are, and what must we do to see them the way they are? That is the path. Right? The whole path is just that. We are not able to see something the way it is. Buddha sees it. And he has taught in different ways how to do it. And in that process, there were numerous debates, really. And the Yogacara position philosophically is possibly a more complete one. A more complete understanding, a very complex understanding of the mind. Yeah. So a good place, if you're interested in Yogacara, a good text to start with is the Sandhi Nirmochan Sutra. The Sandhi Nirmochan Sutra is an early text and it's fairly readable. There is an English translation. Who is it? I forget his name. The Numata Foundation has published, the Numata Foundation you all probably know about. They have undertaken the task of translating the Chinese Tipitaka. So the Sandhi Nirmochan Sutra is readily available. It's a good place to start. Okay. So shall I carry on now? Yes.
I feel interesting on the third Buddhist council and the Buddha by the Asuka Muni. The
Yes.
third Buddhist council, that the main schism is there going on. Theravada is the one who the Orthodox
Yes.
at that moment, and
Yes.
Sarvastivada is like kid out.
Yes.
But later, Sarvastivada become quite numerous and dominant in the northeast of India and become later the vast school of Mahasangika Buddhism.
Yes.
And I want to reconcile. I mean that if we explain the Buddhism in the third Buddhist council in a very nice reason for the schism, then Mahayana and Theravada will be more and easy to, it's not orthodox and the one who out of orthodox. You get my idea?
Not really. Can I rephrase to just check if I have understood? What you're saying is that in Ashok's council, the Sarvastivada are defeated.
Yeah.
So you're not able to understand how they became a big school.
No, I mean that.
Uh-huh.
Because they're defeated, so they are kicked out by the orthodox one. That means the main Buddhism is not Sarvastivada. That if we understand in that way, then later Buddhism become kind of very easy for other religions to defeat the whole mainstream Buddhism in Mahayana in North
Yeah.
India.
This is a very good question. Why? Because one of the things that we must do as students of Buddhism is also to interrogate the texts and the records maintained by different schools. So when we say redactors of the materials, the people who edit and put together the materials do so with a purpose, right? Now, strictly speaking, if you read the information about that council, yesterday I gave some details. Ashok, in one monastery, there are people who have become, lazy, they are not following Uposat. He goes and he purifies the Sangha. So the king has taken it on upon himself, and then there is a council. But it is in one area. To assume that it reflects and has an impact on all the other schools everywhere. Everyone from Indian Buddhism was not present at that council. It was a local event. You understand what I'm saying? So the Sarvastivada who were here were told they were defeated and they left. But that doesn't, we saw Ashok's empire yesterday. In that council, all those Buddhists were not present. Only within that community, something happened. Are we understanding? So when that community carries forward its record, in order to preserve all Buddhist communities, actually all communities, when they preserve records in a certain way, it is to also preserve their own, supremacy or superiority, or where they have won. But that does not always reflect the position elsewhere. It doesn't. So when we become students, it is important that we study all possible materials, because then we get a different picture. We get a larger picture. It doesn't take away from where our faith and what tradition we may ourselves subscribe to. That has not got anything to do with it. And truly speaking, as good Buddhists, the Buddha himself, if you see his entire Sutta Pitaka, what is he doing? He's answering questions. So there is no problem with asking questions when the Buddha himself answers so many questions all his life, right? So we should continue to ask the questions and to look at a different picture. And although it may be easier to just say, oh, they were defeated, and so defeated means what? Where did they go? Did they not practice Buddhism anymore? Were they not Buddhists? Were they not Buddhists? Then where did they go? If they are defeated and thrown out, okay, in that region, in that monastery. No, I'm trying, that's all. But the picture in India is far more complicated. So when we study one tradition, it's good, we get the richness of one tradition. We should always know who we are and where we are anchored. But we should also see who were the others whom were involved with us. You see, sometimes people also say, oh, but this is the only sutta and this is the only teaching. Yes, possibly. It is the earliest preserved canonical material. Having said that, if we say there were 18 schools at the time of Ashoka, in the beginning, at the time of the Buddha, one Sangha. Right? One Sangha, everybody is following the suttas as Venerable Ananda has recited, and the Vinaya, which Upali Thera recited. By the time of Ashoka, we have the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Right? From the style of the Abhidhamma and from its contents, although the tradition ascribes it to the Buddha himself and the legend of going up and down to Tavatimsa heaven, all scholars agree, many monastic scholars also agree, it is the creation of later monks. Why? Because in the Tipitaka, in the Sutta Pitaka, the Buddha describes the human personality in different ways, right? Nama Rupa, yeah, you have Panchaskanda, you have the Dhatus and the Ayatanas, but there is no mention of Dharmas in the Sutta Pitaka, right? And so it's quite evident that in the time of the Buddha, when they had questions, he was there to answer. Now, after Buddha passed away, when they are meditating, they can, in the analysis, in the Vipassana, of course they know that Panchaskanda is an aggregate, can be analyzed more. Then they reach the end, the last non-analyzable constituent. And they start to define Chitta, Chetasika, Rupa, the three Sankhata Dhammas and the one Asankhata Dhamma of Nibbana. Right? And that is how it is through their experiences and through their analysis of human experience that you have the Abhidhamma being compiled. Right? So already some addition. Yes? But it is canonical because it is relying on those materials themselves. Now, the different schools separated because of differences in Vinaya, but they also had, like the Sarvasti Vada, I was telling you all yesterday, when you find the term Vada, then you know there is a doctrinal dispute, right? So you had the Puggalavadins, right? You had the Lokottaravadins, right, who were a branch of the Mahasangikas. The Lokottaravadins said the Buddha was not just great when he became enlightened under the tree. This kind of achievement is possible because he was Lokottara already when he was born. You know, so the idea of supramundaneness of the Buddha already, right? So these were kind of ideas which made people discuss, debate and get into separate schools. But they all practiced and they all wrote many, many texts, right? So we can have our own affiliation to one, but it is just interesting to know because they are our fellow Buddhists after all. Right? So what made them different? What was it that was enchanting their ideas and engaging their ideas, in such a way that they had to do something so different, right? So actually, we can look at the different schools as a problem, but we can also see the different schools as the followers of the Buddha trying to draw out his teachings in the many, many different ways, because the Buddha's teachings are vast. So in the Pali, for example, the Pali texts, you have the idea of Bhavanga Chitta. Any Abhidhamma students here? You all know Bhavanga Chitta? Nobody knows Bhavanga? You know, yes. So when the mind is not engaged with an object, then the six consciousnesses are not there, it falls into Bhavanga. In English, when scholars have translated this, they call it life continuum, because it is the Chitta, because when you're not engaged with an object, You're not dead, you're alive, you're conscious too. So what is that consciousness? Is called bhavanga. But if you look at the Alaya Vijnana, it is like taking that idea and drawing it out to its fullest possible, explanation. So many ideas are already there in Theravada, in the canon, in the Abhidhamma and in the Pitakas. But the Buddha's teaching, when he taught in different places. He taught to monks, he taught to lay people, he taught so many different ways. That's why the number 84,000. Now suddenly, if we were all sitting here as lay people and Buddha came here and he started talking to us about Bhavanga Chitta and we don't understand. We can understand compassion, we can understand ethics, we can understand why we make a mistake in what we see. But even for that, we have to study and practice a lot. So the tradition keep the entire effort in the tradition, in the different schools, is to try and draw out the teachings and to see what happens is then in that process, sometimes one of the schools will hit a dead end. They get into a position. So the Tibetan is laughing because in the Tibetan tradition they have the debates. They study all the different schools and then every evening the monks are paired in the monastery and they have to debate with each other to see if they have fully understood the teaching. So even if you take a simple aspect and the person who is interrogating, his job is to try and lead this person into mistakes so that, I won. And that person's job is to see how he's trying to lead him and to avoid all the traps. Because the teaching, actually, if you study the works of Nagarjuna and the Yogacara, you start to get a view of the teachings in a very different sense. And they are really, even if you don't follow all of them, it makes you, at the least, it makes you very intelligent. Because you understand the debates. Indians, as I said yesterday, very argumentative. And one of the great contributions of Buddhism in India has been the framing of principles of logic and epistemology. So Dinaga and Dharmakirti, who come eventually from the Yogacara tradition, they actually then define the principles on the basis of which debate will be held. So it's not, if I say something and you ask me about it, I cannot just say, oh, Buddha said it, so therefore it is so. Not acceptable. You have to present the argument. And in that, how do you present it becomes extremely important. What is valid, what is invalid, what is a good example. And so if I give an example of something, then the other person attacks saying, but this example is invalid because this. So when you read the debates, they are extremely fascinating. Yeah, so that's really the whole context. And as you can imagine, this is precisely what was happening across this region. And this sort of discussion is exactly what brought people to Buddhism. Because you don't have one dominant authority with saying this 1, 2, 3, 4. No. And so many Buddhists with so many different positions, it is extremely interesting. It is intelligent. It is alive, right? So let's come back to our Kizill caves. Lots of discussion today. Yeah. How do I go to this one? Acha. Okay, so we look at another map. This map is of a desert. I showed you all one small desert area in the big map. This is that desert. To just give you an idea of the scale, it is about 1,000 kilometers across. And as you can see in this picture, it is ringed on 3 sides by snow-capped mountains. On the south here is the Tibetan plateau. Yeah? These mountains, the Chinese call them the Tian Shan, And this portion here is what is enlarged here. These mountains are known as the Pamirs. The Pamirs are called in history the roof of the world, very high mountains, and it is going through these mountains along the edges of this desert onwards to China. This was the route, and this was the Silk Route. What happened is, if you can see, because there are snow-capped mountains on three sides, what happens in summer? What happens in spring? The snow melts, and the streams that come down, they provide water to the edges. And so there was a development of oasis towns. Yeah? And yesterday, some of you were here when I told the story of Zhang Qian, the Chinese who goes to strike a deal with the Yuezhi to fight the Xiongnu, and who is the first Chinese who spends 12 years roaming this area with the pastoralists. He comes back to China and he keeps telling the emperor that we have to find a way, and there is great potential for business, because in Gandhara he saw Chinese goods, yeah, and they were coming from some other routes. They couldn't find the other route, so they stuck to the routes here. And just here, when we do Dunhuang, Dunhuang is somewhere here, there is an approach to Dunhuang which is called the Hershey Corridor, which the Chinese protected from the attackers, and that's how the trade of silk was facilitated. Amongst the communities present here were also the Tibetans. Tibetans were residing here, engaged in the trade, and you have several records at Dunhuang. Remind me to show you the book in the afternoon, which were, which attest to much more than we know normally about Tibet. So, taking a look at a map, this is the same desert, yeah? This is the same desert. Actually now, today, Kashgar is connected by road to Pakistan. You can take a bus from Pakistan to Kashgar through the mountain passes, yeah? And these black dots are city-states which emerged in this area. What the Chinese did was, in order to protect the trade, they extended the wall, the Great Wall, all the way to Dunhuang. And when they sent soldiers to man the walls, they also sent the soldiers with their families, and they trained the soldiers in farming techniques so that if there was no attack, they could grow their own food, because there was nothing here. It was desert. And in that process, because the Chinese are very good at organizing communities and training and executing things as a group. And so when they did with their irrigation techniques, as food grew, then the community started to settle and the trade starts to grow. As the trade starts to grow, these city-states start to emerge. The city-state we are going to look at is Kucha. Kucha, this is known as the Northern Silk Route, this is known as the Southern Silk Route. On the Southern Silk Route, Khotan was very important. Khotan from the most ancient times was a supplier of jade to China. And the Chinese valued jade even more than gold. And from very ancient times, they supplied, this supply line was open. But Kucha comes about later as a settlement, and we know from the texts that are recovered there, I told you all yesterday, 2 new languages were also discovered, Tokharian A and Tokharian B. Tokharian A comes from somewhat east of Kucha, Tokharian B over here. These languages have Buddhist texts written in them. So the texts were being translated in the languages of the people here before actually getting translated eventually also into Chinese. Now at Kucha, another feature of these silk routes is, traditionally Mahayana was on the Southern Silk Route. And the northern Silk Route was largely Sarvastivada. As you know, Mahayana is a very early development in Indian Buddhism. Already by the 1st century BC, you have the Lotus Sutra and you have the Prajnaparamita Sutras. Yes? Who wrote them? We don't know. The tradition, of course, ascribes it to the Buddha. The difference in the two traditions is reflected also in the nature of the texts. The Mahayana texts, the Buddha teaches on a vulture peak, like the Buddha taught on the vulture peak even in the Pali tradition. But the Mahayana idea of the cosmos and the cosmic Buddhas is very vast. While he is teaching here on Vulture Peak, in the different universes, Buddhas in those universes are also teaching on the Vulture Peak over there. His assembly has thousands of Mahasattvas and Bodhisattvas and Gandharvas and Kinnaras, and of course his own great disciples and lay people. So the assembly is very vast, and the teachings generally also focus in the Prajna texts particularly. The Prajna texts are about emptiness of all phenomena. So Mahayana is present on the southern Silk Route, and on the northern it is largely Sarvastivada, coming of course from the Kashmir Gandharan area. Now just outside Kucha, of the present town of Kucha, of course we don't know the ancient town, whether it was exactly located in the same place, but outside Kucha, about 70-80 kilometers outside Kucha, is a cave complex called the Kizill caves. And the Kizill caves, this is an example of some of the materials that you find there. Are you all able to see this clearly? Yeah? Okay. So these are paintings. They are paintings on stucco. Do we understand stucco? It's like a clay and, they may add some things so that it grips the wall, and they make it smooth on the cave walls, and then you paint. In Kizill, in the early paintings, there is a lot of use of a reddish kind of pigment, but later work you find a lot of the blues and aquamarines. The blue and the aquamarine, yesterday I explained to you all, they grind the lapis lazuli stone, and that came from Afghanistan. Materials were being traded which were also used in the production of art. One of the things that the trade routes facilitated is very much exactly this, right? These people locally, they did not have all of these colors. Then when we look at these styles, this is the Tribhanga style I was telling you all yesterday. If you look at the kind of clothes they are wearing, they are very Indian looking, with a kind of dhoti below, we tie the dhoti, and a scarf which is either thrown around or held together. There are various scenes of the Buddha teaching. You will notice yesterday when we were looking at the Gandharan Buddha, he was a little bit like a foreigner, and Ajahn kept saying, is he Indian? Is this one Indian? Yes, because the features and the depiction has a lot of Greek influence, and yes, maybe there are Indians. But you can see now the Buddha looks different here. Doesn't look very Indian. He looks like them, right? Everyone's Buddha looks like them. Yeah. How do you otherwise connect with him, right? And there are all kinds of people who are listening to him. They do take care to have him, with the robe over one shoulder. But his chivara is not any shade of yellow or maroon or orange. It's a dark chivara. He has a halo and this larger mandorla. It's not just behind the head, his whole body radiates. The depiction, though, is still very Indian in its context. The attempt is there to try and show the Indian garb as much as they understood it.
Do we have the description of each picture?
Do we have?
The description.
Descriptions of each of them are there. You will have to, we can, these are actually this was something we discussed yesterday. What happened in this region is that there were various groups, expeditions that went from Germany. Actually, a lot of this is in the Berlin Museum. They took away the stucco, and there's not just descriptions, there is lots of even PhDs done on these paintings, because they reveal many aspects. As you know, there will be stories about here. This is a panel which has various episodes of the Buddha preaching, right? But there are panels which have Jataka stories. There are fragments of panels, because again, when these caves were discovered, these were discovered in modern times. They had been lost to history, right? And with Islam coming on the Silk Route, there was no Buddhism left. There is no Buddhism that is left in Kucha. This is today part of a province of China called Xinjiang. Xinjiang province is largely peopled now by this race called the Uyghurs. And if you read the papers, you will know that the Uyghurs also have similar issues like the Tibetans have with the Han, in the sense that in China, the Han are supreme, and so in all the provinces, the political heads or the heads of administration and the institutional heads are all Han. And so there has been a lot of unrest even in Xinjiang province. Today, the Uyghur are all Muslim. Historically, they were followers of Buddhism. But when these were coming back to these caves, therefore, they were not in use. They were just ruins. And these various universities and museums have taken. So there are one or two I will show you from the Met, and because they were in various stages of destruction, what happens is when you try to put a description together, you have to piece together this with this, with this, with this. Where there is a Jataka tale, you can see the aspects of the story being narrated. Otherwise, you have to just look at it as a fragment by itself from that particular cave. So here again we have teachings. This is a very light one, but you can see the difference between the two styles in the kind of colors that were used. Here you find the black pigment much more. There are throughout the caves, the typical construction of a cave in Kizill, when you enter, there is like a central pillar which has a niche which will have a Buddha. Photography is not allowed inside the caves, and so there are some materials available, but they are not in resolutions which are very good. And now when you, what happens is, so it's like a stupa, the central pillar, and in the niche is the Buddha, and you start to walk from the left side to circumambulate, and then start over there the stories of the Buddha in his previous lives, Jatakas. In the back, there is usually a Mahaparinirvana panel behind the stupa. And then you come this side, and then again episodes from the Buddha's life. At the bottom panel are the pictures of donors. And these are donors. These are and you can see the details. So the kind of information you get from the paintings of the people of that time, it's really very rich. And as Indians, we identify immediately with this kind of dress because we still wear it. You know, this is the Central Asian, the split loose trousers and the tunic on top. And you can see the different shades and the different patterns that they had on the fabrics. The caves in Kucha begin probably in the 4th century. Yeah, they are very old. They begin in the 4th century, and by 7th, 8th century, they went into disuse. And Kucha, as a center of Buddhism, also went into decline. So there is a brief moment in history when these caves were really alive. And look at the amount of work that is done. This is one of the, I was telling you, in the back, there is always a depiction of the Mahaparinirvana. And there is Buddha, you can see the grief of the, and the flames are shown on top because he is being cremated. He seems to be lying on some kind of a bed, or maybe it's a coffin. It's a coffin, probably. Yeah, but it's very beautifully decorated. Yeah. And what is interesting, small details. So this one is in very Indian garb. He has the thread which the Brahmins wear. Across he has amulets on his hand. That one is very clearly a monk. There are different kinds of personages who are to be found in this painting. There is one over there on top who is making an offering of a garland. Can you see that? Yeah.
The coffin is not a traditional kind of burial from India.
No, but he is being cremated. The fire is shown on top.
Combination between the firing and burial together.
No, he's not being buried. And even if you read the records of how the Buddha was cremated, he had given very clear instructions. Anyone knows that? Of how he is to be wrapped so many times and things like that. Now, this would be their own interpretation. Possibly it is to show a beautiful, it may not necessarily be a coffin. It may be like something created in which to place him before burial, right? And yes, you're right, it may reflect their own ways of dealing. This is, so since you were asking about the description of the stories, can anyone hazard a guess what is going on here? It's nice to sometimes just look at a painting and maybe you want to tell me, because I'm the only one who's talking so far, what is going on here? Anyone? You're free to make up your own story. Someone is showing the picture, yes, wonderful. Actually, you can't see what is on the picture, but there is Buddha there. And this is Buddha is being born actually from the side here. So I'm not giving you too many clues because the Buddha is passing away there. So, anyone? You can't see clearly, yeah, all right. Okay, so everyone knows Ajatasattu? Ajatasattu, yeah? So this is a panel, this is a story of Ajatasattu after the Buddha's parinirvana. Now what happens is that Ajatasattu is a very interesting character in Buddhist history. In the time of his father, he imprisons his father, he wants to become king, and we know that Devdatta, the Buddha's cousin, is trying to capture control of the Sangha. So there's all sorts of politics going on. And Ajatashatru is clearly a very bad guy. But at some point in his life, he relents what he has done, and he comes to attend the Buddha's teachings, and it is Jivaka who brings him. And there is that episode that when he comes to the woods where the Buddha is teaching in the evening, the whole place is so silent and so calm that for a moment he experiences fear. He's been a bad guy himself, so he knows fear. And he thinks he's being led to a quiet place so that he himself gets assassinated. And it's a very, very beautiful explanation of a human's transformation and all of the anxieties relating to it. And then, of course, he becomes a patron of the Buddha's Sangha. Now, after the Buddha's parinirvana, the people around him in court, they don't know how to tell him, because they feel that he will be so shocked, so deeply sad, that he might never recover from the grief. So they decide that they will paint this picture on cloth, and they show it to him, and they start narrating the life of the Buddha through the painting. And they narrate the story of the Buddha's birth, of his leaving home, of his becoming enlightened, of his teaching, and slowly through that they come to the fact that now he is entered parinirvana. And even so, even if they have taken a very gentle way to tell him that Buddha has now gone beyond, he faints. He faints in shock. And in order to revive him, he has to be immersed in a vat which has some medicine. So that is Ajatashatru being immersed in a vat full of medicine so that he might recover from the shock of the Buddha's parinirvana. So this whole painting, this is them discussing that the Buddha has, how do we tell King Ajatashatru? Then they hold up the painting, and there he has fainted, and he is being put into medicine so that he can recover. Yes.
Where do we get the material mentioned that story explanation very nicely? Where do we get the
These are not stories in the Pali tradition. So like I said, yesterday we were talking about narrative literature. In India, we are a storytelling country, so it's not unusual that we have many stories. Many. There are, over here in the inscriptions, no. So some inscriptions will tell you who donated or who created the cave, but the stories are not written there. So in fact, what happens when you do art history? Art history is a whole field of study where you need to know your text, you need to know the period, you need to know which were the texts which were being studied. So this was a Sarvastivada area, Sarvastivada stories, their own tales. So when you look at a painting on the wall, it's like, and you're looking at something that was created almost 2,000 years ago, not 2,000, 1,600 maybe years ago, you have to try and figure it out like a puzzle. There are sometimes very few clues. And then many scholars will argue, oh, this is this. In this story, it's very clear because he's being immersed in the pot of medicine. Then you have it very clear. Yesterday I was explaining when we did Ajanta that sometimes there is a lot of dispute on which Jataka is being painted, is being depicted here, because many Jatakas have similar themes, similar episodes of the king, of the ascetic, of him leaving home, of people grieving. All of this makes, it's a very interesting field. You have to know your texts, you have to know your history, you have to know that area, and you have to understand, you have to have a love for painting, of course.
No, I feel very curious because I look at here, then you ask that you guess, then you cannot guess that.
Because you don't know the story, it's all right. But one of the things of art is also, what is it that we, that's why I said make your own story. It's all right.
Your makeup story or the real story?
No, this is a story from the Buddhist text. This is, I'll give you the reference. You see me later, I'll give you the reference. These stories are there. These are the heads of bodhisattvas. And these are in, these are, some of the books, very rare books, in which these materials are photographed and they are not out of print. They have been digitized in Tokyo. So if you look up the Toyobunko site, you will find some of the images. Now, see the complete difference in the depiction, the facial features. And yesterday we were talking about this. Bodhisattvas have mustaches. They had mustaches even in the Indian Avalokiteshvara had mustaches. They have very different ornamentation in their hair. This one is a particularly beautiful one. They take the Indian eye of the Buddha. Yesterday we saw the eyes half open, right? You all remember? No, you all were not there. Sorry. So we looked at several features of the Buddha, and here today, but you see the face is more rounded. It's not completely Chinese, but it is somewhat, Mongoloid in its depiction, not really an Indian face anymore. So there is a massive book on the history of Indian Buddhism. All of you should have it. It is the work of a Belgian scholar called Etienne Lamotte. Lamotte was quite an incredible scholar. He was actually a Christian priest. He was Monsignor Lamotte, and he did a lot of work with Chinese materials. People often asked him, why do you do this? Because he was not even Buddhist. He was actually a Christian priest, and he said, I just love it. That's some of these examples really tell us what is possible in human life. Yeah, the possibility of stepping beyond our own self-imposed limitations. So Lamotte's History of Indian Buddhism is a very big book. It's, I think, about 700, 800, 900 pages worth of work. And one of the things he mentions in there is that, I showed you the mountain passes and the Gandharan area and how difficult it was for people to make the journey across. So in the Gandharan passes, in the mountains there are the passes through which you can go from one side to the other side. And in one of the mountain passes, there was a general who guarded the passes and who ensured safe passage for all travelers, including, of course, Buddhist monks. And because of the compassion with which he ensured the safety of the travelers, Lamotte says that this was possibly the model on which the idea of Avalokiteshvara comes out. Of a bodhisattva who embodies compassion and whose entire task is committed to helping others. So there are these various ideas of how bodhisattvas come about. And so Manjushri, of course, there's supposed to have been a Brahmin from the south who was a particularly devoted disciple and an extremely brilliant one. And that Manjushri is possibly modeled on that one. But then there are more ideas of bodhisattvas, and we will look at some paintings in the afternoon. The very interesting one is a bodhisattva we call in Sanskrit Kshiti Garbha. Kshiti is the earth, Garbha, the womb, the center of the earth. And Kshiti Garbha is usually depicted with a staff in one hand and a mani, a jewel in one hand. And he is the bodhisattva who makes a vow not to enter enlightenment until all the hell realms are empty. Which means that he will help the people who are today inhabitants of hell. That means they have done such bad things that they are born in hell. But even this is the beauty of the Buddha's teaching, even they are worthy of listening to the teachings, and they have a chance to change their life. Maybe it takes very long, but they too can change. And so Kshitigarbha's vow is really actually quite incredible. He says, I will keep being reborn, I will, and he's the one bodhisattva who is depicted as a monk in depictions. All others are like this, bejeweled and fairly ornamented. Yeah. This is the Buddha with his disciples. You see that in the bottom they are trying to replicate the lotus pedestal. Now that is again not a flower that grows there. Yeah. So in the manner in which he is painted, in the manner in which some of the details exist, obviously you know that they are trying to get the reference from the stories which somebody has brought about these details from the Indian side. This is, there are the dwellers in the water. This is only this much, right? This fragment is just this much. So we have to try and figure out which story, where it fits. Yeah. So these are water-dwelling people, and they are shown swimming here. One of them is having a rough time. This one is Ajatasattu with his wife and his minister. This depiction, yes, you have a question? Sorry? Not yet. Okay. I thought you were going to say something, so I waited. This is of a monk meditating. He's probably doing death, contemplation of death. So you have the skull over there. But I think in this one they have truly captured the whole essence of practice and the meditation. You can see he has orange robes here. This is Vajrapani. He is a bodhisattva. How do we know he is Vajrapani? See what he is holding in his left hand is the depiction of the Vajra.
Very Indian kind of sitting.
Yeah. Also very Indian kind of dress. They are also depicting him with a lot of jewelry, earrings, even his crown, and again very big moustaches. This is one of the most incredible and very powerful paintings. This is Mahakashyapa. And any of you familiar with the work of Vincent van Gogh? The kind of strokes used in the background and to describe Mahakashyapa. In fact, it's he's shown here bearded. Yeah, he has a mustache and beard, but Mahakashyapa was by all accounts a very intense person, intense kind of in his commitment to the Buddha and to the practice. So of all the monks, he is the one with whom the Buddha exchanges a robe, and it is him whom Buddha tries to say, it's okay now, Mahakashyapa, we are old, and it's okay to not live in the forest, to sleep under the tree. It's okay to be in a, because they built aramas already in the time of the Buddha, and they were dwelling indoors. And Mahakashyapa says, no. He says, no, I took this life of a monk, and this is the way that I wanted to live, and I will not sleep indoors. And Mahakashyapa is very important in Buddhist history. Why? Yes, he oversees the compilation of the doctrine into the Sutta and the Vinaya Pitaka, the first council, after the Buddha passes, which is supported by Ajatashatru, right? He organizes the first council. So in many ways, and he's the one who, why does he call the first council? Why was there a need to call the first council? Not breaking the rule, but
someone happy because of the Buddha.
yes. There was one monk who made a very loose remark after the Buddha passed away. Something like, oh, thank God, now we don't have this person who will make us follow the rules and everything. When Mahakashyapa hears this, he is immediately worried. Already there is somebody talking like this, then the future of the Dharma is going to be uncertain. So the teachings have to be compiled and systematized in a way that they can be transmitted efficiently. And so he calls a council. So he is a very, very intelligent person, far-thinking person, very intense. And in many ways, this painting captures Mahakashyapa in a way that in other paintings, when you see him later in China also, there will be depictions of Mahakashyapa and Ananda. He's just generally shown as an old man. Of course, he was an old man when the Buddha passes away, because he is the only one of the great disciples who is left. Sariputta Moggallana already passed away. Yeah? Yes?
Related to the Mahakashyapa in traditional Zen school, usually in Vietnam, quite famous about the story how the Buddha rise up the flower, and it says something about that. I try to trace the back, but where do you know the material? Can we get that story?
In Indian Buddhism, there is no such story.
And in Indian Buddhism, we also have no story of the 33 Zen patriarchs and start from Mahakashyapa. No, isn't it?
No, 27. Bodhidharma was the 28th. So the patriarchs that the Zen school looks at start with Mahakashyapa and then Ananda and some more. But frankly, this is not a tradition which originates in India at all. And what we tend to think, therefore, is that by the time Bodhidharma arrives in China, the Tiantai school has already got its own orthodoxy, and it traces its lineage back to India. And in order to validate yourself as an authentic school of Buddhism, it was extremely important to show connection to a text and to a link back to India. To the best of our knowledge of Indian history, Bodhidharma has no such lineage in the manner in which the Zen school traces it subsequently in China. Also, the movement towards Zen practice is attested before Bodhidharma already. It's not that there were wandering meditation masters in China. So in the figure of Bodhidharma, you get the person, an Indian, who comes with the Lankavatara Sutra, as a sort of, so he gets anointed the first patriarch in that sense. So fabrication is a bad word to use, but it is possibly the way the school tries to authenticate what is not an Indian tradition. The Chan school in China is the product of Chinese genius. The kind of approach to texts and the way of study and later the practice of some of those koans and meditation, not Indian cultural context at all.
How about the other 20,000 patriarchs? We can trace the back material.
Which one? The other patriarchs. Yes, some of them are historical, but whether that lineage followed the way in which the Chan school lists them is problematic. And certainly the story of Mahakashyapa holding up a flower and the Buddha, Buddha holding up a flower and not saying a word, and Mahakashyapa smiling. That is only in the Chan school. We don't find it anywhere else. But that's okay. That's okay. It's a beautiful story. So it is supposed to be the first transmission of the Dharma without words, directly mind to mind. Right? So The direct transmission, mind to mind, not really found in Indian texts, Indian Buddhist texts for sure.
But with the mind cannot be transmitted.
Yeah, so this is a musician here with God. I don't think you can see the instrument there. I'll share this PowerPoint because sometimes with the light the images are not that clear. But this is, you can still see that the context remains very much Indian, from the clothing and the way in which the figures are depicted, the body therefore, but the face is not Indian anymore.
Are there any meanings of the legs, the crossing like that, when there's certain kinds of forms sitting, standing?
This?
Yeah.
This is a very Indian way of standing. So if you see the deity Krishna, he always stands like this. Yeah, it's there is no meaning. It's just a style. I mean, everything doesn't really have a meaning. It's how we do certain things. Yeah. And this is now a depiction of a monk which is of a later period. You see the number of blues, and you now see that he is wearing some kind of a warm garment under his robes. Yeah. This is in the collection of the Met actually. And this is supposed to be an attendant. You can see that they are trying to depict the dhoti. They are trying to do the three banga, but it's not quite happening. The dhoti doesn't go all the way down. It suddenly ends over here like some sort of long shorts. So how does a community which has not been to India, which is listening to the stories, which is trying to understand some of the context of the stories, and how do they depict in art what they see? So for example, in one of the paintings of which I don't have a picture, it was not possible to photograph that. So there is the Buddha in the niche, and on the side in the painting there was like a small white dog who was looking up like this at the Buddha. And so it's very puzzling because we don't know any stories about the dogs in that time, and and generally speaking, the tradition is not very favorable to dogs. So I was a little puzzled, and we asked the person there, what is happening here? How come? What is the dog doing here? He says, that's not a dog. That's a lion. So they had not seen lions. Right? There were no lions in that part of the world. So how do you paint an animal which you have not seen? It's ferocious and maybe growling. So they depicted it the closest that they could within what they knew and they understood. This is also a fragment of a painting of the Buddha. And this now, I just want to quickly share with you in the last few minutes about, so I went to Kizill, I've been to Kizill, and my own interest there was actually the most famous monk to come from Kucha is a monk who is half Indian, and his mother was from Kucha. His name is Kumarajiva. In the Chinese know him as Jumu Loshe, and he is known as Kumarajiva, the great translator. He lived between 350 and 409 or 413, depends on which record you're looking at. And he was born in Kucha, and he was, by all records, a genius. When he was 7 years old, his mother becomes a nun, and she takes him with her to a master in Kucha itself. But because he was so brilliant, the local people came to make many offerings to him. And his mother, this is quite wonderful, she says, this is not a good idea for this little boy to be pampered like this. And so she leaves Kucha. We are talking of, therefore, 358 or 59, and they come to Kashmir. She brings the young boy to Kashmir. He studies with an Indian teacher called Bandhudatta, and he studies the Sarvastivada there. That is where he studies Sanskrit. That is where he studies Sarvastivada. He is a little boy. They are in Kashmir for 3 years, and the mother decides, okay, now it's time to go back. When they were coming back on the Silk Route, they stop in Kashgar, where he studies the 3 Vedas. He also studies the art of divination. And in Kashgar, he meets a prince who has converted to Buddhism and become a monk. That prince teaches him the teachings of Nagarjuna. And so, having studied Sarvastivada first, he now studies the Madhyamaka method, and he becomes so famous for his learning that by the time they start heading back home to Kucha, already the people are organizing a huge welcome. And I said to you before when I showed you the map that in the northern route it was only Sarvastivada. That is true until the time of Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva is the first one to teach Mahayana on the northern route. He is separated from Nagarjuna by maybe 200 years, is separated with great geographical distance, but he is in many, many ways a real and true disciple of Nagarjuna. Yeah, and so what happens is, yesterday I was telling you all that all of this transmission of Buddhism, it's sometimes on the map, like we saw on the map, I can just draw arrows and it went from here, here, here. It doesn't go like that. And we see that how? We see that in the life of Kumarajiva, for example. So he has come here, he has studied one school, on the way back. Then what happens in Kucha is his fame. He starts to study in some monasteries near Kucha. He finds the copy of the Prajna Paramita and he starts to study the text. Right? Now, in the capital of China, in Chang'an, his fame has spread over there. What were the information networks? How did people know who is a brilliant monk where? The word information was being carried all along the Silk Route. And in a king's court, to have a brilliant religious master, it is very prestigious, right? The people venerate you and the king can control his subjects even better. The king always wants to be seen as a patron of eminence, of brilliance in all fields, right? So the king from China sent an army. He sends an army to defeat the king of Kucha, and he says, keep Kumarajiva alive, bring him back. I want him in my court. So the city-states that I was showing you, they were independent states. They had some protectorate or some kind of understanding with China, and every now and then there were wars. People were fighting with each other all the time. There is trade going on, and there is a monk being captured. Right? He was captured by the general. The general was not a supporter of Buddhism at all. And so the general humiliates him. He forces him to drink wine. He forces him to lose his chastity. Kumarajiva is a young boy. His story is incredible. Now what happens is, as they are heading back to the capital of China, the king over there is assassinated. And another king takes over from another dynasty. So what happens? This general was affiliated to the old king. He cannot go back to China. Right? So he carves out a kingdom over there, Liangzhou, himself. Right? And they stay there 20 years. Kumarajiva is in their custody. And the general and his whole clan, the Lu clan, they were not supporters of Buddhism. So he was not allowed to teach. But because he was skilled in divination, which is something he studied in Kashgar, he is able to make predictions which help them protect and defend themselves, and so they look upon him as a fairly okay guy. 20 years go like this. Then what happens? The one guy who took over in China, he is defeated by the Yao, and the Yao are very keen again to have Kumarjiva in the court. So Yao Xing, he again sends an army now, because they keep telling the Lu, send him. And of course they don't want to send him. They don't support Buddhism, but they know the value of this man. They know how important he is. So they don't send him. So now Yao Xing sends an army, and they free Kumarajiva, and Kumarajiva finally comes to Chang'an, that is today's Xi'an. He comes in 401. He was born in 350, right? 20 of those years he has spent in captivity, not in physical jail, but no permission to teach Buddhism. They were not supportive of Buddhism. And this Kumarajiva, by the time he has come to Chang'an, Yao Xing knows what a genius he is. He gives him a whole garden in which there are 800 scribes. And Kumarajiva makes translations from Sanskrit, because he studied Sanskrit in India. When he was captured in those 20 years by the Chinese, he knows his Chinese. He was from Kucha, please remember, Tokharian. And he makes the translations which become definitive for subsequent spread of Buddhism in China. In East Asia today, the translation of the Lotus Sutra is Kumarajiva's translation, even today. The translation of the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, even today, Kumarajiva's translation. He translates the Prajnaparamita Sutras. He translates the Sarvastivada Vinaya. He translates the Sukhavati Vyuha Sutras. The amount of translation he did in the 10 or 12 years that he was in Xi'an before he died is incredible amount of work for one single man. And his translation is different how? We began this lecture by discussing the problems of translation into a different language, where the culture is different. There is another problem, and that is of idiom. There might be a saying in English, take the simplest one, a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. Okay? Now, you translate that into Thai or maybe Hindi, it is meaningless. Nobody speaks like that in that language, right? So, translating into a different language of a different culture has many complications, right? Now, the Kumarjiva's biography says he held the Sanskrit original in his hand and he spoke like a book. He was a very good Dharma teacher. And what you see in his translation is not word-to-word literal translation, but they are beautiful translations. He tells his translators that the Indian language has great poetic and literary aspect to it. If we translate it word-to-word without understanding it, it is disgusting. We have to retain literary quality in the end product also, which means in the Chinese. So he has to know his Chinese well enough to be able to express something which to a Chinese reader has the same kind of literary value that the Indian found in the Sanskrit. Are you understanding what I am saying? So Kumarajiva was really a very great translator. And in the catalogues, there are 3 meditation manuals that are ascribed to him. And there is a very large commentary. He writes to the works of, to the Prajnaparamita. It is called Mahaprajnaparamita Upadesha. This is found only in Chinese. It is not there in the Tibetan. He ascribes it to Nagarjuna. He says it is translated from Nagarjuna's work to Chinese. But most scholars today believe that it is his work and the teachings of other monks which are compiled. It's a fantastic commentary to the Prajnaparamita texts. Why am I talking about Kumara Jiva? Because when you look at the art and the culture of the place, what was the Buddhist context? What was happening there? The caves are from the 3rd century, 4th century. That is also the time of Kumara Jiva, and with this kind of brilliance that is being nurtured in that location, it is but natural that all forms of Buddhism become very dramatically enriched. So this is the route to Kucha. You can see how barren the whole area is. The caves are called Kizill because in the local language Kizill Kum means red mountains. The mountains, yeah, and the mountains are literally like this. They are reddish in color, and this is just outside the guest house of the research center at Kizill where we were staying. And these are the Kizill caves from outside. This was a visit I made in 2012. You can see that it is sandstone. It's not rock, right? And many of the caves from the outside, they are damaged or they are in danger of falling. So what the Chinese have done is all this is built in modern time to try and protect the hillside and not allow it to collapse like the old ones have done. Many of the caves are, like I said, depleted of the work because the stucco was taken away. But still there is a very large part which is available. But of the available, only few caves are open to the public. I was very fortunate because I went with my teacher. My teacher for Chinese Buddhism is a Belgian scholar called Charles Willeman, and he is very famous in China for his work on Chinese Buddhism. And because it was with him we went, even the caves which were locked for the public were opened for us. So we saw some 80-90 caves on one day. We had to hurry and we had to look through all of them. Most of the caves are viharas. Most of the caves are viharas. There was a large community of monks that was studying there, right? And very lushly decorated worship caves, like I told you, a central pillar. And unfortunately, I really, it's only a memory. I cannot show you pictures because we were not allowed. But this one is another picture that I wanted to share with you. You know what this is? Yes. Just one more minute. Yeah. Yeah, he's my teacher. I went to Kucha with my teacher.
He's rector of IBC.
He's rector of IBC. Yes. So this is there were two huge Buddhas here. There was a 16-meter high Buddha here, and if you see the next, this is a statue of Kumara Jiva, and the caves are in the background. And this is Kumara Jiva, where he is stupa. This is inside, and this is in Xi'an. Kumara Jiva died in Xi'an, and they cremated him, and then they put the ashes in a stupa. This is inside here. When we went here, this whole place was locked, and we were not allowed entry into the place. So over here, there was a window where the glass was broken. And these are actually some bricks which were here. So I climbed on the bricks, and through the broken glass, I put my camera in, and I got the picture of Kumara Jiva's stupa. And okay. So one last story that I want to tell about this. I don't have the other picture. So if you can imagine this Buddha, if you're standing here like this, over there in front is a vast expanse, and in the far distance there is the Mutsat river. And that was the route that the pilgrims took and the traders took. Yesterday we discussed briefly what was the purpose of building colossal Buddhas. These Buddhas were not destroyed by anybody like the Taliban. They were just sandstone, so they disintegrated with time. But you can see how the wooden the armature would have been fitted into the hillside, and the kind of effort that they made. So these huge Buddhas, the pilgrims going from there can see, and they can find this support, because traveling such long distances was an exercise that was filled with fear of being robbed, of being bitten, of being eaten by wild animals, of sandstorms, so many fears. So Avalokiteshvara, when he is depicted, you have the Ashtamahabhayas around him. From those he protects you from. It's snakes and elephants and lions, it's robbers, it is the sinking of a ship, so many things, all the anxieties of the people on the trade routes, right? So this is, so with that bit on Kumarajiva, and this is his stupa. A very, very great translator. Okay, and my time is up. So maybe if you have questions, we can take them in the next session. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Very interesting about the Buddhism on the Silk Road. Maybe we can learn the Buddha teaching or the history of the Buddha, or maybe history of Buddhism from the painting or Buddhist art like this. And we have a little information about the Buddhism on the Silk Road, but from the Professor Dr. Supriya, right, lecture, we can understand more. And then maybe afternoon we have to travel from the north of India to China, maybe Tunhuang, Pamiyan, and approximate for something like that. Maybe we continue in the afternoon. Thank you very much for the morning session. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, please take lunch at the cafeteria.